Hi, Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec here. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the revelation that Apple is changing the default timeout for USBs to be used on the iOS devices. Now, in an earlier preview release of their new iOS, they had limited the use of USB control or USB data to a week after the screen was locked, meaning that if you locked the screen and you ultimately then didn't use or didn't unlock the screen again, a week later the USB port would basically only become a charging port. Now, you may have heard about some of the devices that law enforcement are using called GrayKey. GrayKey uses basically that USB interface to try pins repeatedly. Now, GrayKey doesn't beat the thing that we were all worried about. I say we were all, the FBI was worried about in the case of the Farouk. You may have remembered Farouk's iPhone, where there was a claim that maybe some dormant cyber pathogens were on the phone, and maybe that was a reason why we needed to ultimately get it unlocked. Of course, this sparked a big encryption debate, or revitalized an encryption debate between Apple and the FBI, or more accurately, between the FBI and literally everybody doing encryption. Did they need encryption backdoors? Was that necessary for national security, as well as the rule of law to prevail? With this new release, Apple is limiting this to an hour rather than a week. This is still in preview. I think it's important to note this is still in preview. It's not yet one of those things that's rolled out to every device, but it appears to be default on and will lock out the phone after an hour. Now, this is one of these spots where you really have to ask, what's the motivation here, right? And Joseph Cox actually had a really good, he's a reporter, had a really good post, kind of a thread on Twitter. We had thought about this a little bit, chatted about this a little bit last night with a couple of our colleagues, and I think Joseph came to the same conclusion we did, which is that this is not designed to be a security feature for your average user to combat iPhone theft. The reality is that most users who get a phone stolen, again, they most cases have bought them through Apple or through their provider, and they can get them IMEI locked, meaning that these can't be, basically can't be reset. So even if you factory reset the device, again, no go, device still won't register on the network. Separate from that, when you step back and say, by and large, are criminals who would steal your phone, physically steal your phone and have it in their possession, do they have devices like GrayKey that can go through and break the, basically break the device passcode? And I think the answer to that, by and large, is no. GrayKeys cost around $10,000 and are only being sold currently to law enforcement agencies. So this move here, which seems largely designed purely to beat these GrayKey style devices. It's rumored that Celebrite has a very similar service or very similar device. When you look at this, I think you kind of have to step back and say, this doesn't look like something that's designed to protect regular users from cyber criminals. This looks like something, honestly, that's designed to protect users from law enforcement. Right now, I focus on the FBI, of course, because I live and work mostly in the United States. Although there are other places that I travel to that certainly, their law enforcement may not necessarily follow the same rules of law as our law enforcement back in the U.S. Right, so I'm going to keep a U.S.-centric focus here, but of course I understand that there are other threat models elsewhere in the world for other law enforcement that may not necessarily follow the same legal guidelines necessarily that the FBI and local and state law enforcement in the U.S. do. That said, Apple still has the option, although off by default, for 10 passwords, right? So if you enter the passcode incorrectly 10 times, it'll wipe the device. More accurately, it simply wipes a secure enclave of the key. Once the key is gone, of course, again, there's nothing that can be decrypted there, unless you suddenly know how to break AES, in which case you probably work for some nation state someplace. But look, realistically, if the FBI had access to simply crack AES, this certainly wouldn't be something that they'd be worried about from the going dark argument. So this is kind of an interesting space here, right? From an enterprise customer standpoint, I have to ask realistically, what's your concern here, right? I mean, now from a security standpoint, there's no reason that the USB port should have ever been necessarily use once the device was locked anyway. I can see potentially an hour. The hour sort of makes sense to me. You lock your phone, you plug it in, you're going to sync. Do you really want to unlock the phone? That's an inconvenience. But this becomes a security convenience trade-off. The fact that it was the USB port was able to be used for data indefinitely has always seemed to be somewhat a little bit insane to me. This is something that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So again, I applaud Apple on this side. Now, from an enterprise security standpoint, does this really matter to you one way or the other? I think the uplift in security is probably negligible. Although, again, this depends entirely on your threat model. Again, if you had an iPhone as a corporate device or a corporate asset, and that device were stolen, particularly, I'm picturing my international travelers here, this device was stolen in another country, what do you do then? Right? What's the go-to then? So I totally see where again in another country potentially some law enforcement or customs or intelligence could be then breaking that phone. But of course then again we're questioning what's the time here, right? How long do they need to break that basically break that passcode? Look, bottom line, once this iOS update rolls out, it seems to me that that's going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, to do that same analysis. So, a couple of takeaways here, right? One, I think Apple's poking the bear here. I don't think that the criminal threat was huge. I do think that they're poking the bear. I know the FBI, or I suspect the FBI, is going to come back and say, "Hey, Apple, you're totally hurting us. You're hurting other law enforcement." I expect that this is going to amplify the going dark debate. However, and let me come back here before I do the however. With the going dark debate, this is the typical, if we can't see the decrypted devices, then certainly, we're not going to be able to prosecute crimes. Criminals will run rampant on the street, and basically the economy will fall apart, right? I think is the general claim, right? Or society will fall apart. Again, I think I've expressed pretty convincingly in the past, I don't think that that's a credible threat or a credible scenario. I don't think that's going to happen ultimately. But Apple, I think, is poking the bear on the going dark side for U.S. Law enforcement, who will only break into a phone with a warrant, with a court-issued warrant, and of course, probable cause precipitates that warrant being issued by a judge. That's not the situation in a lot of the rest of the world, particularly as you're crossing a border, right? When you cross a border, again, it's free range in a lot of areas. And I'll tell you, somebody who travels internationally a lot. As a matter of fact, I'm coming to you live from London here. I'll tell you that there's a lot of places that I go. London, or the UK, not included in this, but where the borders and law enforcement in general are kind of lawless, right? I mean, the burden for a warrant, right, or even the need for a warrant to do some of that analysis is pretty weak in a lot of areas. And so as we look at this, I'd urge folks to kind of note that while it may appear that Apple's poking the bear here, and I sort of see that argument, again, that's kind of the argument that Joseph Cox made, I don't know that that's necessarily the case that they're poking U.S. law enforcement. I think they're looking globally at the privacy and security of their users. And if we do that, unless we're going to start pushing iOS images specific to the United States, specific to some of these other regions that'll remain nameless because I still want to be able to travel to those without having, criticize their governments, or being seen as criticizing those governments. The reality is that, without pushing region-specific or country-specific iOS images, this is a risk that we have to deal with, right? So Apple has to step back and say, from their perspective, what does the overall security of the organization look like, right? Or an organization look like, security of people look like, based on, and I think you have to step back and say, based on the worst case for law enforcement abuse. And when you do that, I think you kind of step back and say, okay, if we're going to protect the security of our users, I think that there has to be some recognition that gray key and devices like it present a risk to folks around the globe. That's not to say that this doesn't put a dent in the capabilities of U.S. law enforcement, and I'm sympathetic to that. On the same tone or on the same note there. I think this really is one of those points where, where Apple has done the right thing, provided that the new iOS rolls out as the beta has, with that 1 hour lockout. Right, GrayKey previously identified the week, or noted that 1 week lockout, and did communicate with law enforcement folks who either were considering purchasing or had already purchased their devices, and made a note about how, hey, look, you got a week to knock these out. I do think that was probably a sales pitch, a little bit of sales pitchy, right? Noting that you may need more of these devices. You can't just queue them up in the in the back there. You may need more GrayKey boxes. I think it was probably a sales pitch, but look, they recognize the threat. They recognize that they have a product today that, if or as people upgrade to iOS, if these settings settings hold, becomes largely useless from an investigative standpoint. So again, as folks roll up to that new iOS, again, they're not going to be able to break that code. So I guess kind of questions, or wrapping this up here, is Apple poking the bear? Maybe, right? But they're not doing it without reason. They're doing it because, again, they're looking to secure their users overall. Second thing I want to note here is that, again, Apple iOS users have had and continue to have the ability to implement a 10 failed logon key wipe that will nuke the device, right, or nuke the contents of the device effectively by removing the encryption key. This hasn't changed. That option is still available. It's still off by default, right? Fat fingers happen, right? But I mean, again, really the idea there is that this doesn't represent, again, the FBI argued in the Fruit case that if that feature were enabled, that they simply couldn't brute force the key and they needed another method, right? Again, this really hasn't changed a whole lot over the last really 2 years. The only thing that's changing is that your rank and file folks, again, I think we're looking at what are the defaults, right? If we haven't gone in and set better security defaults, or sorry, set better security settings over what the defaults are, does that actually impact the security of the user, right? So again, or the FBI's ability to break in, law enforcement's ability to break into a phone. So I guess kind of coming back around, again, this is a feature that, or security features preventing the FBI from using something like GrayKey have always existed, and again, this iOS version doesn't change that. It simply makes it more difficult in a default configuration, much like when Apple moved to default encryption, right? So encryption by default. There was a big law enforcement outcry then. I expect that we'll see more of that coming here. But again, just like when we moved to default encryption, Apple said, hey, look, we are improving the security of everybody. We know historically, and this goes for all of InfoSec, not just mobile phone usage, we know that people tend to use the defaults. A large number of people tend to use the defaults, and we know that the default choices that these OS developers, iOS being no exception, these developers make have a real impact on security for our users, right? So while I'll say that Apple definitely poked the bear, I don't think they're poking at the FBI. I honestly believe that they're poking at, again, or looking at the privacy for users in other regions of the world, where, again, law enforcement action may be a little less scrutinized than it is in the U.S. Right? So now, look, as a byproduct, again, it is going to hurt the FBI. It is going to hurt the investigative capability of state and local law enforcement agencies. I guess I'll wrap it up here and say, Apple, fist bump. Appreciate the work that you're doing. Again, we know in the InfoSec community, these are some hard trade-offs to make. As a forensics practitioner, and we do a number of mobile device cases every year, this is going to make our jobs harder, right? So I'm not celebrating here. The privacy advocate in me is definitely celebrating this. The forensics professional in me is kind of like, this is not going to help us. This is definitely going to hurt. So again, coming all the way around here, Apple, understand the difficult position that you're in, and certainly applaud you. I'm never going to criticize somebody for making things more secure for everybody, even if it hurts some pieces of the work that I do and the work that law enforcement does. Anyway, before I close out here, I wanted to mention an awesome Threat Hunter shirt brought to you by Alien Vault. Alien Vault, of course, is a rendition InfoSec partner, but they were kind enough to send down some Threat Hunter t-shirts, and we certainly appreciate that. Anyway, appreciate your time. Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec, out.